Here's another old video that I remember from back in the day. 2012 was a different time. It was the peak of YouTube atheism, and almost all of the YouTube atheists were lefties. It was Obama's re-election year, and the Republicans had just chosen Mitt fucking Romney as their candidate, which is about as awe-inspiring for anyone on the right as drinking a warm glass of tap water. It was around this time that I started drifting from my libertarian views towards the left, which I would peak at around 2014 before a slow recovery. So I remember this video, and would like to take this opportunity to explain why I think it is dead wrong. For starters, the title is Why Libertarians Are Idiots. Dusty always did like to stir up the shit, and it's a big reason my taste for his content didn't last very long. There's something about people who love provocation for provocation's sake that turns me off their arguments. But without further delay, let's kick this thing off.
So in my opinion, libertarianism is really idiotic. It's based on a lot of really foolish beliefs. Number one, that the market somehow has magical self-regulating properties, that the market can regulate itself without help from the government. And I've asked them why they think this, and this is what they tell me. They say that if a corporation acts poorly, that the people will find out about it, and the people will not buy their products, and therefore corporations won't act badly, and the market will regulate itself.
There's nothing magic about it, Dusty. Businesses, by and large, respond to the demands of their customers because without the business of their customers, they go broke. The concerns of the people buying your products are of direct interest if you run a business. A lot of progressives and socialists seem to think that Adam Smith's invisible hand is a reference to some kind of magic or illusion that's untangible. But it's really just people responding to incentives and serving their own interests in a way that actually betters society. Because think about it. No one told all these convenience stores that they have to open up and carry thousands of products at low prices to serve the people of their community. They do it voluntarily because they want your money. And the way to get your money is to carry the items that you want for a price that you're willing to pay. It's a simple concept. Also, corporations are created by the state as a means to grant special privileges to certain organizations. These actions actually make competition less free and restrict the market alternatives. It's also not that businesses can't or never will do things that people don't like. It's just that the power of the state actually makes it harder to penalize those businesses because the state runs protection for them.
This all sounds good, I guess, if you're a 12-year-old and you've not observed the world as we live in at all. But in the real world we live in, that's simply not possible. People are stupid. People are dumb, ignorant, lazy-minded monkeys. They go to work 8, 9, 10 hours a day. They come home, do their chores, go do their dry cleaning, wash their clothes, clean their houses, wash their cars. They just want to watch a little TV, play a little video games, meet a girl, have some sex. They don't have time to sit around and research every product they buy before they buy it. Nobody does this.
I wouldn't say freedom is a concept just for children, especially when we can spell out how it works in both theory and practice. But actually, yeah, Dusty, most people do this to one extent or another. People read up reviews on businesses that they want to check out. For movies they want to watch, for books they want to read, for vacations they want to take, for hotels they want to stay at, etc. But let's take your own argument, and let's turn it on its head for a moment. Most people, regardless of their political leanings, will agree that the individual knows their own interests better than anyone else. Most libertarians are reacting to this reality. If individuals cannot be trusted to take care of their own interests, and if individuals can't be relied upon to make good decisions just for themselves and their families, then certainly they cannot be relied upon to vote for leaders in government who will impose rules on all of society. That's right, Dusty, the same government that you're saying society needs to right the wrongs of bad businesses and evil corporations is a monopoly on force and violence, which is granted its power by the same dumb, ignorant, lazy-minded monkeys that you think are incapable of making their own choices. You're defeating your own argument here.
And that's evident if you just look at companies like BP. How much oil did BP dump into our oceans? And they have the highest profit margins they've ever had. The market does not regulate itself. It cannot regulate itself. And the thought that it can is totally idiotic.
This is a pretty common argument against libertarianism, and I think that is totally fair. I think it's a valid concern. But for starters, you have to realize that most pollution occurs on property owned by the government. I'll set aside my grievances with the concept of unjustly owned government property and just get right into why the problem occurs. Why does the tragedy of the commons occur? There's little to no incentive for businesses or even individuals to maintain land or resources that they do not own. And again, if these industries weren't protected by the government and granted pay-to-play privileges by the state, they could and would be held more accountable for their pollution. So the state doesn't solve this issue. The state only sells resource rights. Also, even in the most extreme libertarian systems proposed, there's a system of recourse for people who have been infringed upon by businesses polluting. I actually just released a video of how you can have military, courts, and police in an anarcho-capitalist society. There's a wealth of libertarian and ANCAP literature that covers these topics. I'd actually recommend that you look into the arguments before just dismissing them as a joke.
The truth is, if you're paying attention at all, people are terrible. They're terrible, selfish assholes who would do whatever they can to get over on their fellow man, even a little bit.
Well, gee, I sure am glad we have a government with a total monopoly on imposing rules that can use force to extort money, can destabilize entire regions of the world by overthrowing their governments, can directly arm, fund, and train extremist groups, can rack up $27+ trillion in crippling debt to pass it on to human beings who haven't even been born yet, can incarcerate more citizens per capita than any other nation on the planet, and can make all their gross human rights abuses legal, merely because they own the monopoly of force and violence to create laws that they themselves don't have to abide by. Yeah, fucking Walmart and Coca-Cola are the true evils here. You're arguing against yourself, Dusty. If people are shit, and people are stupid, and people are corrupt, that is an argument against having a state ran by these people. Let's just look at the 20th century. Okay, the last century, not counting 2 world wars. Governments murdered over 250 million people. If people can be a threat in private businesses without the power of the state, then people in the public arena with the power of the state are a direct threat to peace and prosperity.
And that's why we have to have an organization that protects the people against each other and against corporations.
Oh, God. You know, when I'm railing against progressives, I at least try to understand their arguments. I do a podcast every week with 2 left-leaning co-hosts to an audience that's overwhelmingly left-leaning. A steelman version of a progressive person who opposes libertarianism, I think, goes something like this. While I admire libertarian views on most social issues, like legalizing some, if not all, drugs, and keeping the government out of the bedrooms of private citizens, libertarianism goes a bit too far in the economic realm. I think we have to have protections for the less fortunate, and we have to have a system in place to ensure that people aren't taken advantage of by large corporations who put profits over people. The government does need some restraints as well, and to make sure that it isn't taking advantage of the people, we try to make this happen by getting money out of politics and making sure that good people are appointed to the positions of power. Something like that. Look, there you go. There's a steelman of a progressive take on libertarianism. But Dusty, you didn't do your homework here, dude. You came across like somebody who has never heard a coherent libertarian argument against any of this. Let's hit a few more topics to see if you can redeem yourself here.
People are always complaining that corporations have bought our government. The reason that they're allowed to do that is not because of too much regulation. It's because of too little regulation. There should be so much regulation against corporations lobbying our government that there's no way they could do it. There should be government-run watchdogs who keep a constant eye on every corporation to make sure they can't get their dirty money anywhere near our politicians.
In the same way that tax-exempt status today attracts the most unscrupulous characters to go into organized religion and become televangelists or these late-night hawkers that sell you miracle manna bread or something like that, it's the same privilege that attracts money to politics. Many big businesses want to restrict competition, and a lot of politicians and bureaucrats are more than willing to exchange cash for favors. As far as regulating this goes, as long as the power is there, the money is not leaving. I don't care what laws you pass, it's not going anywhere. Do you think this issue wasn't pervasive in the Soviet Union, for instance? Power is granted more on the basis of political ties than any just qualifications. The only way to actually force businesses to compete with each other and to get money out of politics is to eliminate the power of the state that tilts the scales in favor of some overall. Force these businesses to compete with one another and take away their lifeline of taxpayer bailouts when they fail to do so.
Libertarians don't want the government involved in anything. For somehow they've convinced themselves that the government is evil, but government is not evil. Okay, just because our government is broken does not mean government is not useful. There's a reason that every country in the entire world has a government. A government is very necessary.
The argument that we need a government because every other country has one is pretty weak, Dusty. At one point the world was run by kings and emperors. Should the founders of the United States have cast aside their ambitions for a restricted republic for that reason? Of course not, for the same reason that you yourself understand that we don't need religion just because 95% of humans on the planet are religious in some way. Not all libertarians think the government shouldn't exist. Ron Paul, Joe Jorgensen, Harry Brown, Milton Friedman. The list is endless of libertarians who think the government should exist and run some very basic things, but they understand the issue of power and unintended consequences. Personally, I think the conversation about the government being a necessary evil is less about how evil it may be, and more about how necessary it truly is. I think if you look into most, if not all, the problems that exist today, the line of the issues traces back to government rules and regulations. That probably sounds hyperbolic to a lot of people, but if you actually hear out the arguments from ANCAPs and libertarians, there is almost always a government failure somewhere in the past that resulted in something you think is wrong. Monopolies. They can't exist without the state rigging the system. Poverty. It's been greatly exacerbated by the welfare state, and the working poor have a third or more of their income extorted by the very government they feel they need to protect them. The list really is endless.
And you can ask them directly, what happens to people that don't have enough money? What happens to people who weren't lucky enough to be rich? What happens to the poor who can't afford their life-saving medical procedures and can't find charity to pay for it? What happens to those people? And the libertarian response, literally, is fuck them. Oh, well, they're just unlucky. That's evolution, survival of the fittest. Fuck them. They're just going to suffer and die. And to me, that's an indefensible position. Fuck that.
Well, that's one hell of a straw man there. First off, without the state stealing a third of your income, and without the state ruining 95% of the value of our dollar over the last century, and without the state taxing, over-regulating, and incentivizing employer-based healthcare, we'd all be much better off, Dusty. Without the state granting patents to drug companies, without the state banning drug imports, and without the state having a monopoly on approving drugs, we'd all be much better off, Dusty. I'm noticing a trend here. I've personally never had a conversation with a libertarian where the answer to what happens to the poor is fuck 'em. My answer is that regardless of your circumstances, you aren't entitled to steal my money or empower an institution to use its guns to steal my money through the threat of violence. That's bullshit, and it's the system you support, Dusty, not me. At the end of every regulation and rule that you want the state to enforce is a gun, Dusty. Healthcare would be cheaper, easier to access, it wouldn't be tied to your job, and you would have more options if the government wasn't so heavily involved. This is the unintended consequences of regulation supported by people like you who think they know what's best for society and imposed by force on the masses.
There's plenty of money to go around, man. This concept of money is an invented concept anyway. We just fucking invent it. They just print the goddamn dollar bills. There's plenty to go around. There are people with fucking billions of dollars in their bank. Billions! Even if you took 98% of their money, they would still have so much money they couldn't spend it 10 lifetimes.
Okay, I guess we're just going to have to wrap it up here. This is why libertarians are constantly mocking progressives and leftists as being economically illiterate. I just don't have the time or patience to get into modern monetary theory, why it's complete garbage, and why nothing is more ridiculous and utopian than the idea that we can just throw out money and all the ills of society will be solved. You really have to have little to no understanding of how economics works to think this pans out, let alone address the moral issues of property rights and the theft that is involved in that idea. Dusty goes on to say how we need government for education, which is also absurd considering we spend more per capita on education in the United States than almost any other nation and get mediocre results. High school diplomas are largely worthless in the United States, and students graduate with essentially no skills to offer employers that are even worth a $7.25 an hour minimum wage. Dusty also concludes by saying the role of government should be to do whatever it takes to make the citizens happy. Again, how are libertarians considered the utopians in these arguments? This is all just ramblings of a dude high off his ass thinking he knows how to run society without even a base level understanding of the arguments against his positions. This is embarrassing, and I'd call it a joke if our society wasn't run by people like this, if politicians weren't voted into office on the whims of people who think like this. Alright, so look, I'm out, and remember that libertarianism is just the result of understanding property rights and following the arguments supporting those rights to their logical conclusion. Peace.